If you don't know who this strange man is that's staring at you right now, his name is Michael E. Porter, and he wrote a book called Competitive Strategy and Competitive Advantage. And essentially, I'm going to give you an introduction to competitive analysis and how to essentially do industry analysis within a market. Now, what Porter invented was Porter's 5 forces. Essentially, in the center here, you have industry competitors and intense rivalry between different companies and firms within an industry. And then you have people who are buying products and suppliers giving raw materials to those industries, and then substitutes are kind of pressuring that industry and new products that come into market to essentially use to assess the long-term potential profit making of an industry. So if you want to think of an industry, let's think of the software industry as a whole. You might think within an industry, you have video editing like Adobe Premiere that I'm using or Camtasia. That is an industry within an industry. You can kind of take it from a big picture point of view, or you can zoom in and find different industries like the content management system industry within software, or social media like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. There's variations of sizes and strength. But, the way Michael Porter puts it is that, is the game good enough?
And we simply must understand why. Because one of the essential parts of developing a strategy is to know how good the game is in which you're trying to compete. The second essential question in strategy is a company's position within its industry. Again, if we look at many industries, we see that no matter whether the industry profits are high or low, companies in the same business have widely different levels of profitability. Some, year in and year out, make a lot more money than others. And any strategist must understand what it takes to be a superior performer in the industry and not be one of the ones that's below average. Both of these questions are vital in developing strategy.
And how is that game going to change? And really, his framework is just a way for you to evaluate and assess industries at different levels. So, we could look at the software industry as an entire whole and say, okay, the competitive forces of suppliers and buyers and substitutes and new entrants aren't really affecting the software industry because it's so massive. Nothing is going to replace software right now. It's essential to how we work every day and for a very long time to come. So, but if we zoom in on content management system and you think WordPress, Wix, Squarespace, and Shopify, well, those are only 4 competitors within the industry, maybe a few more. And the story's a lot different because they have to deal with substitutes like Webflow or Figma when it comes to design. Or, if somebody's going to make a completely new product and that product's just better, that kind of puts pressure on it. But I'm going to get on depth on each of these forces. So essentially the first one, industry competitors, is that within an industry, you have a set of competitors. They're all competing for, let's say, probably a very limited pool of money, possibly. And there's a level of intensity. It's not always intense rivalry. Sometimes you have friendly competition or collaborations that raise the profitability of an entire industry. There's no price cuts or no price wars. Or you have fierce intensity. I would say software is a fierce, intense industry. If you look at what's called the streaming wars, such as like Netflix, Warner Brothers, Paramount basically, and Hulu and Amazon Prime, it's a very, very intense industry. And every single TV mogul and monopoly is trying to get into the streaming space, and Netflix has to defend itself with either price cuts, introducing ads, or delivering better content at the end of the day. Whoever's bringing better content at the end of the day gets more subscribers, gets more people talking about it. So it's very fierce in the streaming war, essentially, but it might be really friendly. And maybe, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry, I would say it's not that intense. Now, to kind of go through each of these forces, we're going to have an imaginary bakery and we're going to make bread. And basically, one of the first forces that kind of affects our bakery is going to be suppliers. If there's a monopoly on your supplier, such as flour, if there's one factory making flour, they have a ton of power over the price of our bread. At any time they can raise the price of their flour as a commodity, and therefore we have to raise the price of our bread. And that means they have leverage and power. And fortunately for us, bulk commodities like flour tend to be a very low price, and we can keep the price of our bread very low and affordable for our customers. Bulk commodities tend, you could just buy from different competitors and different quality of flour, and there's all these factors that go into it. But really, what you need to understand that suppliers really, if they have a monopoly on the production of their raw material that they're selling to different groups, or they have a product where they're selling to many customers, and you're just a micro fraction of that of their revenue, they can indeterminately raise their prices for their product. So again, that's just what's considered a competing force against your product and your firm, essentially. So it's called the bargaining power of suppliers.
You're always buying from suppliers in any industry. You're buying inputs like labor, materials, and machinery. To the extent that suppliers have bargaining power, they can constrain the profitability of an industry because they can, by bidding up their own prices, force the industry to absorb costs that it can't pass on in turn to its own buyers. They can strip the profitability out of an industry.
Now you have buyers, and for buyers, if I have the only bread in town, I have the leverage over buyers to determine what my price of bread should be. And essentially, if there's more options of bread, if you go to the store, prices tend to be pretty near the same with some variation depending on what it is. If it's raisin bread, well, the raisin bread's going to be a little bit more expensive than white bread because it was a little bit more to make. But here, the buyers have all the power. They have the power to choose between the white loaf versus the artisanal bread versus the cinnamon French toast bread. And this is what's called.
And finally, of course, every industry sells to buyers. And those buyers may or may not have bargaining power. If they have bargaining power and if they're price sensitive, they may bargain away the profitability of the industry by demanding lower prices, by expecting more service that they don't pay for, and so on. So what we see is that in any business, the fundamental long-term profit potential is a function of the strength of these 5 competitive forces.
The bargaining powers of the buyer, this is a force within itself. So you have 2 areas it's coming from, suppliers, price fluctuations, supply chain fluctuations, and then buyers kind of saying, man, this inflation's really sticky. I don't want to buy as much bread as I used to because bread's just getting really expensive. Then on top of that, you have the threat of a substitute. And basically, wraps against bread is going to be sort of like, they're cheaper. Have to cut bread. It's just easier to use. I wrap up my condiments easier in my meat rather than cutting bread. And it could just be preferences.
Industries also compete with substitute products or services. These are other products or services that can do the same thing as the industry's product. So, for example, if you're selling steel, you're worried about plastics and other materials because they're substitutes for what your industry produces. If an industry faces close substitutes, this places a cap or a constraint on prices in the industry. You can only raise your prices so much, or you'll start to erode the volume as the buyer deserts you to the substitute.
And then finally, you have new entrants. So if you're an existing competitor within the industry and you have a product, you are always going to have a problem of new people or a threat of new people coming in to take part of the market share or part of the profit making that you're going to create. Or on the flip side, most of the time, you're the new business owner, you're the small guy, you're the new entrant. Let's say I want to introduce garlic bread to the market, right? And the great thing about garlic bread is that you have the differentiator, and that's the taste of garlic compared to all the rest of the bread. So basically, that is another force that forces price changes and the profitability to get lower. So it all ties back to the fact that each of these
There's the threat of new entry, the threat that new competitors can come into the game. And they bring in new capacity, and if entry is easy, if it's easy for new players to come into the industry, that's going to erode the fundamental attractiveness of the industry. So one crucial dimension of industry structure is the barriers to entry.
Forces and pressures have to be managed within a business to keep your prices at a level at a high volume. So really, the two outputs that you're controlling for is the amount of volume and sales that you're making and the price that you're determining to make the volume. So if your price goes higher, you're going to make less volume because the price is too high for the most of the market, and vice versa. So, most of the time, you're going to be the small business owner kind of starting that new idea or startup. And, let's apply this to a more modern equivalent like software here. Let's have VS Code open, and we're creating software. And a lot of the time, my bone to pick is with software developers or anyone who's starting a startup is that they code their brains out before ever thinking about what are the barriers to entry for my product? Like, what is preventing me from actually selling my product to a human being and they get to experience it? So essentially, one of them is economics of scale. So the numbers of users hitting the server, think microservices, you have to manage that through an API or whether it's proxy to distribute the workloads amongst different microservices or a monolith, depending however you cite. You still have to scale up. You still have to deploy the software. On top of that, you need product differences, proprietary knowledge. There's a learning curve to software. You're going to need to learn a lot. You're going to need to build that code, and you need to make it easy to understand for other coders to pick it up and start building on their own to scale your team. And then you have to develop brand identity. Like, you could code anything, but if it has no emotional impact for your customers, if it's not well known, try to think of Salesforce example or Shopify. There's no impact or something that makes it like, oh man, this makes it so easy for me to be a business owner. I will recommend it to everyone else. Shopify has a really strong brand identity. It has that color green. So it has to make people feel something. And then switching costs, like if I'm using Excel already, why is Salesforce better than Excel? Why did they make that transition? You're going to have to justify that. I think capital requirements, like don't just find funding, whatever you could do, or save money to start it. And then access to distributions. A lot of products that come to me, they just don't make it easy to access the software. So it's like going to a drive-thru. If I go to Wendy's and I ask them, hey, can I get a cheeseburger? And you have to wait an hour for your cheeseburger to download. No one wants to buy it. On top of that, you need to worry about government policies. Like for software, you have the GDPR, you need consent and cookies implemented. It's just these are just barriers that prevent a new product or your new product from getting into the market. And then competitive retaliation. So like if your product is disruptive enough, and depending how sensitive you hit them with your new product, they're going to retaliate. Either, they're going to copy what you did or your style. A great example of this is TikTok. So, a long time YouTube, Instagram, Facebook are consuming a ton of users' time for the past 10 years in 2010 and all this time. And then TikTok came out, and Vine was kind of like just the beginning of that. But TikTok came out and started eating up user engagement. Like user engagement dropped on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So in response, or retaliation is building YouTube Reels, Instagram Reels. And it's just kind of stealing or copying that style. It's not stealing, but taking inspiration of what TikTok did and reinventing it, even though TikTok has its own way to defend itself, I think, which is a whole nother conversation. So there's a lot to talk about when you apply a framework to something and think about how does my product compare to other products and what does the industry look like. So yeah, that covers it. So thank you. And check out my blog posts out below. If you want advice for your startup or advice for your product, give me an email. Just don't even have to subscribe. You don't have to do any of that, just send me emails. I really appreciate it.